Spring training games start today, but what in spring actually matters? I'll tell you next. Yes, welcome on in to Braves Today for Thursday, February 20th. Your source of news, notes, and updates on your Atlanta Braves. I'm your host, Lindsay Crosby. You can follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Crosby Baseball. You can follow the show on Twitter, Braves_today. We have a Facebook page and an Instagram as well. And you can find all of my written work, bravestoday.com. That's the Braves Today Substack, as this is both a podcast and a newsletter. And spring training games start today. Quick clarification, it is not the Atlanta Braves. Their first game is on Saturday against the Minnesota Twins in Fort Myers. But the Los Angeles Dodgers, their first game is today, will be televised this afternoon. And then there will be games every day from here through the beginning of the season. The Dodgers and Cubs play today because they start their season a week earlier than everybody else over in Japan, remember? And so, I feel like a lot of times when spring training gets here, people don't necessarily know what to pay attention to from spring. What matters, what doesn't matter. So let's break it down. I've got 6 things that you should look out for, not only with your team, but with any team you're watching, but especially with our team, with the Atlanta Braves, in spring. And the first one, very obvious, injuries, right? Guys getting hurt in spring is a matter of just it's gonna happen, okay? Guys get hurt every year in spring. Sometimes those injuries linger into the regular season, sometimes they don't. And the hard part is knowing if a thing could potentially linger or not, because we don't have a lot of information that says, hey, this injury directly happened because of that thing in spring. But what I think it's useful for is getting an idea of who is prepared for the season and who is not, who might be behind in their prep because of an injury, and then areas where you maybe need to adjust a workload expectation for a guy. Last spring, Ronald Acuna Jr. had that knee thing. I remember hanging out outside the Braves clubhouse in Northport early in the morning when he got back, and I think I might have been the first person in the media to actually get a video of him walking back to the clubhouse. Didn't appear that he had a limp. He had just flown in from LA where he was checked on the knee. Reminder, his knee issue in spring was the same knee that he tore the ACL in 2021. So not the same knee that he tore the ACL in last season. Obviously, there's a question. Was instability in that knee, did that make him do something different that then caused him to injure the other knee? We don't know. My gut would say no. ACL tears don't really work like that, but we just don't know. And we see it every year. Guys get nicked up in spring. Sometimes it lingers, sometimes it doesn't. The thing you have to understand with spring injuries is just because a guy is injured in spring doesn't mean he'll be injured in the season. And just because a guy gets through the spring healthy doesn't mean he'll make it through the season healthy. Spencer Strider is a great example of this. He looked fantastic in spring. I want to say he didn't allow a run until his final appearance of the year when he stayed out later than he was supposed to, emptied the tank a little bit, and gave up a run or two late. But then season came around. He got hurt two starts in, and we found out back in December when he did the Casa de Club podcast with former MLB pitcher Corey Kluber, we found out that he felt like trash in spring and just pushed through it. Nobody knew. He didn't tell anybody. So just because a guy looks like he's healthy in spring doesn't necessarily mean he is fully healthy. If a guy gets injured in spring, it doesn't always mean he's going to be injured or set back in the regular season. Sometimes they're connected. Matt McClain was still recovering from his 2023 oblique injury in the spring, and then ended up suffering a shoulder injury, and then had a rib injury trying to rehab from the shoulder injury. So he was injured all year, but Gunnar Henderson had an oblique injury, and he was perfectly fine all year. I do think the nature of the injury, though, can tell you something. A great example of this, Kyle Bradish of the Orioles. If you remember Kyle Bradish, the start of camp last year, the start of spring training, he had an elbow sprain. He eventually got onto the field for Baltimore, made 8 starts last year, and they were very good starts. He was activated in May through June. His 8 starts, he went 2-0 with a 2.75 ERA. It was a strikeout rate of 12.1 per 9 innings. Comes out to 32.5%, was the best mark of his career by 7.5%, and then went down with Tommy John, right? So, we don't want to see anybody get injured, but this is when injuries will start to strike. The most common injuries I feel like you see in spring, obliques from hitters, right? It's a lot of rotational force. Hamstrings from position players. Oftentimes it's running to first base or sprinting in the outfield, but usually it's running to first base. And for pitchers, you'll see shoulder and elbow. Again, doesn't always mean that they'll miss time in the regular season, but they might. Doesn't always carry over. It's just kind of something to be mindful of. That's obviously the biggest thing in spring. The goal of any manager in spring is just to come out of it healthy, right? And there's been players who have talked about the lockout shortened spring training that they had, or the 2020 shortened ramp up over the summer. They've actually said that maybe it's not the worst thing in the world to go from 6 weeks of spring training to 3 or 4, because they have less concern over getting hurt by doing all of this stuff when it doesn't matter in the spring. There you go. Somewhat related to injuries, but not always, is lineup moves. The thing you should not worry about is guys coming out of games early. Very rarely do the MLB veterans make it an entire spring training game. Even when you get towards the last week of spring, only those last couple games will you see a team keep the starters in there into the 7th inning and things like that. Oftentimes, it's 2 at-bats and you're done for the day. But I do think you can get some information from the lineups, okay? And this is something, like, it's hard to know when a team is trying something out and when a team is committed to doing this because we're going to do this in the regular season. But you can get general trends. For instance, if you see in games that all 3 of them are in, either Michael Harris or Ozzie Albies leading off in front of Jurickson Profar, pretty consistently, it tells you that in the regular season, odds are what's going to happen early is that Jurickson Profar is going to bat second. But if you see one game where it's Harris, Albies, Profar, that doesn't necessarily mean Profar is going to bat third. So don't overreact to a single game. But if you see 2 weeks, 3 weeks where a team is doing the same thing, that tells you maybe this is something to watch out for, right? And I do think in that specific situation, I'm going to be looking to see what Atlanta does at leadoff. I've been an advocate. Justin Toscano, we talked to him last Friday. He said the same thing. Put Profar second. Let him bat second all year. I like Michael Harris in front of him. I've seen arguments online, bat Harris 6th, bat Albies lead off. I've seen arguments bat Profar lead off. I've seen arguments platoon Harris and Albies lead off. And I think that games where the 3 of those guys are all in the same lineup, that's where you'll be able to get some information as to how Atlanta plans to configure the top 2 spots. And then we'll get some information when they're all in the lineup, how Atlanta plans to configure the trio of Austin Riley, Matt Olson, Marcell Ozuna. Because we saw at different times, Olson was pretty consistently batting 4th, but Riley would bat 3rd sometimes. Ozuna batted 3rd sometimes. Again, don't overreact to one lineup, but if you notice them consistently going, let's say, Riley, Olson, Ozuna, odds are in the regular season, that's what we're going to do. That's what we're going to see on an everyday basis. In just a minute, I want to talk about some of the pitching observations to make. We'll get to that next, right here on Braves Today. Welcome back to Braves Today. Lindsay Crosby talking about spring training games that start today for the Dodgers and Cubs, Saturday for the Braves, and what to look for, what actually matters from these games. I think the second area, all pitching here, right? And this is going to be pitching, like pitcher velocities and then changes in their arsenal. So let's take velocities first. Something we have to understand is pitchers are ramping up the length of their outings. They're also ramping up on their velocity, okay? So a lot of guys are going to start off at lower velocities than what you will see from them in the regular season, what you saw from them last year, things like that. There was a note from Mark Bowman of MLB.com on Wednesday about Ian Anderson throwing his first live batting practice. His fastball was sitting around 92. In 2021, before he started having the arm issues, he was averaging, when you round it, 95. When you're looking at pitcher velocities in spring, an increase is more significant than a decrease, okay? Because again, you're gonna see lower velocities, especially early in spring, as guys are still getting acclimated to throwing with intent and effort behind it. But velocities going up can potentially tell you a few things, especially when it's a larger velocity jump than maybe you were expecting, okay? So the first thing that it can tell you is a given pitcher, may be farther along in his prep for the season than maybe we knew about. The average, like your MLB starter in spring is going to get 5 outings, right? That may be a situation where they're not breaking 90% effort until the back half of that slate, right? They're 85% effort in some of those early ones, 90% effort and things like that. And they're not necessarily going with regular season start effort until maybe that final outing. But if you see, let's say Ian Anderson, for instance, he's sitting 92 in this first life BP, his first start, which will probably be later next week. If we all of a sudden see him sitting 94 in that first start, when his average in 2021 was 95, 2-mile-an-hour jump between a BP and a one start early in camp tells us that probably his average velocity this year is going to be higher, right? The jumps mean more than the drops. This doesn't always happen, but usually it's a sign, one, a guy's farther along in his prep than you're expecting, or two, a guy has done some velo work and is going to be throwing harder than he was in the past. Tariq Skubal is a great example. Last year for the Tigers, dude was hitting 100 miles an hour when camp opened. His average fastball velocity last year was the highest of his career, and he rode that enhanced effectiveness along with increases in his other stuff into a Cy Young. So if AJ Smith-Shawver comes out throwing 95 in his first spring start of the year, that's a pretty safe sign that either A, he's ahead of schedule, B, he's done a lot of strength work in the offseason, mechanics work, and he's going to end up throwing harder this year than he did last year, or both. But if Chris Sale comes out and is sitting 91, 92 in that first start, that's not as big of a deal to me as a guy sitting harder than we're expecting in that first couple starts, right? The other part of this, we did touch on this a little bit yesterday, is new pitches. Okay, we talked about Hurston Waldrop bringing the curveball back. We talked about AJ Smith-Shawver adding a cutter. This is the time when either A guy has wanted to add something and he's going to tinker with it in spring, or B, a guy was working on something in the offseason and he's going to unveil it in spring. A good example of that second category, Spencer Strider and the curveball, right? We heard rumors, Braves Fest last year, things like that he was working on adding a pitch. It turned out to be a curveball. We first saw it in spring. It looked to be a very good addition to his arsenal before he got injured. No, I don't think those two things were connected. But that's where you saw it in spring. We have the reports on Waldrop. We have the reports on AJ Smith-Shawver. But if somebody else shows up and throws a pitch that we didn't know that he had, that's obviously a big thing to look at. Another thing to look at is unusual usage of a pitch. And great example of this, and I was out of Northport for this last year, AJ Smith-Shawver in that changeup. AJ Smith-Shawver threw a ton of changeups in spring last year. He didn't have great results because he was intentionally throwing changeups when he normally would have gone with a slider or a curveball or something else. Because the organization wanted him to get comfortable throwing that changeup to both lefties and righties. They wanted him to get comfortable with that changeup when runners were on base, when there was runner score position, when there was no outs, two strike situations all the time. New pitches and new usage of pitches is interesting in spring because it gives us an idea of how this pitcher might be different in 2025. I honestly don't necessarily think spring training results matter at all, but the process of how you're getting there for a pitcher is important. Strider looked great last spring. That was something he was way ahead of schedule and just outclassing everybody. Again, spring training results don't matter, but we saw his new pitch, the curveball. We saw him pitch with a little more velocity in spring, I feel like, than we were expecting. And he looked like he was ready to go for the season before that injury hit. In just a minute, let's get to some things involving backups, some things involving prospects. We'll do that next, right here on Braves Today. Final segment of Braves Today here on Thursday the 20th, talking about the start of televised spring training games. We have the Los Angeles Dodgers taking on the Cubs today in spring training. Again, Atlanta starts on Saturday. But one of the things to watch, I'm thinking of this more for for hitters than pitchers, but really it's on tap for both. It's position battles. Think about who we need to earn spots, right? We're trying to figure out the final couple spots in the bullpen. We're trying to figure out the fourth and fifth starter spots. As they're lining up their rotation for the first week, we know Chris Sale is going to go in game 1 of spring. Look to see, are they going with 7 starters in the first 7 games? Are they going with less? That'll give you an idea. We've already said we think Ian Anderson and Grant Holmes have an advantage because they're out of options. But if Grant Holmes doesn't get a start in that first week, and Bryce Elder does, or AJ Smith-Shawver does, or whatever, maybe that's an indication that either Grant Holmes is behind in his prep, or they're thinking more about using him in the bullpen than they are in the rotation. Similar to the bullpen, think about how guys get used. This could be a situation where when you have a starter in trouble and you're going to bring in a reliever, let's pay attention to what reliever you bring in and in what situation do you bring them in. This isn't always descriptive. Sometimes teams want to get their veterans a clean inning of work. They'll use, I'm going to use the word throwaway. It's not a throwaway player, but they'll use somebody who they're not testing out for a opening day roster spot to come in and finish up an inning. And then they'll go to the next guy in the pitching plan the next inning. But let's keep an eye on the pitchers that they schedule to go, the situations that they're put into, and how they do in those situations to have an idea of what the team's thinking about, what their role might be, and their chances of earning a role, right? Who do the Braves throw into a save situation in spring? That's a joke because nobody cares. But let's look at who plays in what situation. And at the same time, let's look at who doesn't play in a specific situation. Think about shortstop, right? It's considered to be Orlando Arcia's job. There's Nacho Alvarez is also an option to start at shortstop. So is Nick Allen. But if you get into games and every time Orlando Arcia leaves the game, Nick Allen takes over at short, and Nacho Alvarez is playing third, or Nacho Alvarez is playing second, that might be a message that Atlanta agrees with some of the external evaluators who don't think that Nacho Alvarez is going to be able to stick at shortstop. Position battles, you can learn something from position battles, and not just who is likely to make the roster and who is not. You can also learn, what does the organization think this guy can do? Maybe Nacho Alvarez gets all of the shortstop reps in spring. That can also be a sign that Atlanta's not 100% confident that he can stick it short, and they're trying to get as much exposure at shortstop for him as they can to help answer that question. Because at this point, Orlando Arcia can play short. Nick Allen can play short. He might be the best defender on the roster in the infield. Michael Harris is the best defender on the roster. But you can have an idea here of how you feel about, or how the organization feels about guys by how they get used. Maybe Luke Waddell, who is in camp as a non-roster invitee, maybe he's a guy that they only play at second base and not shortstop. That's either a sign that they're fully confident in his ability to play short and don't need to see it, or it's a sign that they don't see him as being a possible contributor to the roster, and so they just play him wherever they have on the field, and his job is to help fill out the rest of the roster, right? You can learn a lot from these things. You can also learn a lot from breakouts from prospects. And the idea here is, if somebody comes in, some prospect is able to come in and look very good, especially when they get into games when they're still major leaguers in the game, that can give you an idea of who is possibly a major league contributor early. I'm really thinking about the pitchers here. I don't think that Carlos D. Rodriguez or Christian Cairo or Adam Zabrowski or anybody is going to potentially impact the major league roster this year. But let's say that some of your younger starters get into a game. Herson Waldrop, let's say he gets a start and looks really good in spring. It might be time to say, okay, he clearly was not ready when he came up last year. Maybe he is ready to come up now and start in 2025. Maybe they only use Herson Waldrop in relief. And that is okay, maybe either they're not considering him for a starting spot on opening day. He's not part of that 7-man battle for the last two, or the 5-man battle for the last two spots. Or maybe they've already decided that he's probably going to work out better as a reliever than as a starter. Watching how guys get used, how prospects get used, and who impresses as a prospect. Drake Baldwin is a guy that I feel like is definitely going to impress in spring. And if I'm Atlanta, I'm going to find opportunities for him to get into games where the major leaguers are still in games, because I want to see how Drake Baldwin handles major league pitching. Because if Sean Murphy gets injured and misses 2 months again, like he did last year, Drake Baldwin is probably the guy you're going to call up to start over some rotation of Chadwick Tromp and Kurt Casale and Sandy Leone, right? Watching for prospect breakouts can give you an idea of, is this guy ready from a baseball perspective to contribute this season if needed? Can give you an idea of how the organization feels about that guy. And also, if a guy looks particularly impressive in spring, it might be an opportunity to seize on a little bit higher value than he may have had via trade. Couple things to think about on this. Again, the Braves don't play today. They play on Saturday, but there will be baseball on today, so I wanted to make sure that we went ahead and mentioned a lot of this. If there's something else that I'm not thinking of that you think matters in spring, I want to hear from you. I'm on Twitter at Crosby Baseball. You can leave a comment on YouTube down below. In the meantime, if you're listening on audio, do us a favor, leave us a 5-star review. If you're on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you know when we drop the next episode. It'll probably either be another Brian Sitker press conference, or it will be another show from us. In the meantime, this has been Braves Today.